start the recording. Yes. So yeah, welcome, Dee. So the reason we were very interested from Save the Children in this approach is that generally, and I don't know what everybody else's experience on the call is, that so often one of the first steps in social and behaviour change programming is to do formative research, which involves sort of really trying to understand the perspectives of the community and the and the households, and to understand what the drivers of our particular behaviours are. And, you know, I mean, much of our experience, a lot of what happens a lot is that we sort of, you know, write terms of reference, we get a consultant to go out and collect all the data and write a report, and sometimes it's often sort of has gaps, or we don't feel like it's done in an in-depth way enough to really get to the bottom of all of these drivers and barriers and so on. And so it was actually Joy Del Rosso who used to be with Save the Children US in the nutrition team, who mentioned this. He talked about Empatica and the approach that they used in Indonesia with Alive and Thrive, and she felt that it was, you know, she was very excited about this sort of very different way of doing formative research that maybe would be more appropriate for development organizations like us. So with that in mind, we've been discussing with Dee and Empatica, and thought that it would be really useful to do a webinar to really understand this approach. So maybe I'm going to now just pass it on to you. Well, just in terms of process, Dee, I'm going to let you introduce yourself a bit more than what I've done, and explain, maybe give an overview of the webinar. But in terms of how we want to manage the webinar, could you please all write, if you have any question, well, first please introduce yourselves in the chat box, and then if you have any questions or comments, please add them into the chat box. Dee's not going to look at them, but Alice will take note of them all the way through, and then we'll tackle them at the end. And so if you could also keep all your questions for the end, and we'll discuss them. So maybe Dee, could I please let you introduce yourself better than I have? And then just please go ahead with the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. I hope everybody can hear okay. Yeah, I have been working in participation actually for many years. I spent 10 years living in Bangladesh, 12 years, 10 years living in Jamaica, 3 years living in Indonesia, and have worked extensively in Africa as well. So I've done a lot of stuff, but learning all the time. And I think in the last 10 years, we've been experimenting with this immersion research and improving and enhancing it, and thinking about it very reflectively. And now, you know, feeling fairly confident that it's applicable to a whole wide range of situations. I've put this little presentation together with the SPCC sort of slant on it, but we've worked in a whole range of sectors, from education, livelihoods, sorry. You're probably seeing that. Livelihoods, education, health and hygiene, migration, recently social tensions in Lebanon. So there's all kinds of applications, and all sorts of parts of project cycles. So it may be in the design or formative stages, it can be in evaluation, it can be sort of scoping and just understanding, you know, we don't know what we don't know, just doing exploratory research. There's all kinds of different ways. So with that in mind, I'm going to, this is only an overview. We have a one week fully a training program for people to really get to know it, which covers sort of particularly focuses on power dynamics and oppositionality, bias and ethics and so on. So this is really going to be quite a rapid overview, and I can talk about reality checks and immersion. So I'm going to keep an eye on the clock and not talk for too long, so that you can have some questions, and often we learn more from the questions. So, okay, so let me start. So the premise of all of this is really about whose reality. We are in a development space now where we have a lot of constraints, value for money, results-based management, all kinds of things which put a lot of pressure on us to be able to prove change, not least of all funding pressures. But I think often we lose sight of who's change and why we want to change, and that sort of real embeddedness in how people value change and what matters to them. So this is really it's a bit of an antidote to some of the current ways of finding out. So Natalie mentioned Empatica. I work with them part-time. I'm an advisor with them, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them at the end. Right, so this is us. Okay. Right. So reality check approaches are immersive. That's the main point about them. And by immersive, some of you may have heard this expression before, but some of you may have heard of it in terms of like language training. You go into a situation, into the context, and completely immerse in it for as long as required. This means moving out of comfort zones, moving out of capital cities, going out of cars, walking, sleeping in people's own homes, and that way having interaction. So it is the immersive element is what's key to this. So you know, a good field visit is not the same thing. It's a direct or virtual immersion in the lives of other people, and with a focus on understanding motivations, behavior, and how people make choices. A little bit of this presentation I didn't include, and actually I was at IDS day before yesterday and did include, was about bias. But we all know that particularly in behavior change work, there's an enormous amount of bias comes out in trying to understand what people, we have our own confirmation biases about behavior, but we also, the participants, the people themselves, often want to please us, the sponsor bias, often acquiesce, habituation bias, social desirability bias, all those things which make our understanding of the situation less authentic than it could be. So this approach, we hope, to some extent, mitigates a lot of those sorts of biases. And it's based on this idea that experiential knowledge, so being there, experiencing it for ourselves, is a critical element of research producing people-centered accounts. So research or evaluation or study or any other word you can put there, finding out, but in a way that is empathetic with people. Now you see why we call it Empatica. So my favorite of all proverbs is this one, and I think it sums up what we do. The only one who is on the anthill, only the one on the anthill knows the ants are biting. So we have to go on the anthill and experience the ants biting as much as we can as well, to be able to understand those perspectives. In behavior change, particularly understanding the perspectives around constraints to change, which are often quite difficult to find out in other ways. In the complexity, everybody's talking about complexity aware programs and monitoring, and it's important to get as much insights into the worldview of others. Okay, so the reality check, which is one form of immersion research, very much relies on building trust. This is one of the first and foremost. You can't have an authentic immersion experience unless you build trust. The photograph that's up there now in front of you is quite an interesting one, because this is in Nepal, and the researcher is the man crouching down, and he's shaving the head of the elderly father of the household, grandfather of the household. And that's a very intimate relationship. And I just wanted to share that picture to show the sort of intimacy that can be obtained when you're living with people in their own homes. And here's another picture. You can see the person on the right hand side. She's eating very simple food together in the family in quite a remote spot in Indonesia, just living an ordinary everyday life. So it's in people's own space and time. Those of you who may be familiar with the Power Cube, I know Save the Children does quite a lot with power mapping and so on. John Gaventa's Power Cube. This is actually a missing space because this is where we participate in other people's space. So we, if you like, disempower ourselves from all our trappings of expertise and so forth, and go into people's own space without requiring them to make the efforts that we usually do in other forms of finding out. So again, just a few pictures just showing how relaxed and informal. This picture is an interesting one because it was doing an immersion with researchers, so finding out their constraints to doing research. And obviously you don't go and talk to them at the university. You hang around with them, chatting in their coffee breaks and other times, and of course living with them in their own homes. This photo from I think it's Malawi. You would think, looking at that, there is a focus group, or there is something, that is being convened perhaps from outside. No, this is just an example too of fitting in with other people's agendas. So if you happen to be living in the community and meetings happen, being able to be a sort of fly on the wall, just being part of that, listening in. And this is the way that we hope to gain a deep understanding of human behavior. So that's the sort of fundamentals. Now, I go through a whole lot of I's now. Everything begins with I. Having said already that immersion, living with people, is the fundamental core of the approach, there are a number of sort of other I's that I wanted to talk about. That by living with people, you become a temporary insider, and you can appreciate and understand the context better. It's informal, very informal approach. It's an interactive approach. It's inclusive, and it's iterative. So let's go into those in a little more detail. So the insider, living the context. So here is this is a picture from Indonesia, Kalimantan, where we are actually doing the work for Alive and Thrive, one of the places we're doing it. Taken a little bit earlier this year, but you see a lot of water. So the houses are built on stilts, and it's flooded. Understanding all of the constraints around getting vegetables and fresh fruit from actually living there has brought enormous insights, and we're developing a human-centered design process with the people in this area now, recognizing their huge seasonal constraints to sort of nutrition behavior change. This is a photograph from Nepal. The man on the right is the researcher. Two things about this. One is perhaps a surprise for many people in Nepal that a man is working with women in the fields. It becomes extremely acceptable when you are living with families. You're like a brother if you're a man, or a sister if you're a woman. He was also pretty useless at harvesting, so was there to learn. Just chatting about the problems of that particular year of their wheat harvest and the impacts that was going to have on their food storage and food security. Opportunity for a lot of chatting with the shared context in front of you. Another picture from Mozambique. This one is going to collect water, so people can talk about the difficulties of a 2-hour trip to collect water, but actually doing it with them and recognizing not only is it difficult, but when you get there, the water hole looks like that. And I know when I've carried water, not doing it very well, and I'm being told off for bringing only half a pail of water back with me. Another example of a shared context, you can see, if you can see my clicker here, these people in the photograph. This is again Nepal, trekking for 4 days to get to a village in Humla, and where, interestingly, the Nepal Living Standards Survey has only ever covered 4 households. So all the data from Humla is dependent on 4 households. So when it says 100% don't have toilets, that's because those 4 houses don't. So we went there and lived with people there and discovered all sorts of things about, in fact, these families have a lot of gold. They were using US dollars currency, all sorts. So they were not financially poor, but they had a lot of other access-related poverty issues. But the main point of this is that we, by going on that long journey and understanding what remoteness really means to people on an everyday basis, made a big difference to having meaningful conversations. Working with trash pickers in Indonesia, living with them. And this last one, just again to give you a flavour of the different applications. So we're working on social tensions in Lebanon, so living with Syrians in makeshift housing, and also living with poor Lebanese and trying to understand a little bit more about the tensions. So that's an important aspect, this living the context. Now the next thing is this informality. So obviously I can't ask you because you're not mic'd up, but I usually, you can imagine this question now, which is the researcher. This is from Ghana. Just have a look at the picture and answer it for yourselves quietly. Most people, well, I get lots of different answers, but if you look carefully, the woman in the middle in the blue t-shirt is the least able to do what she's doing. And she's actually the researcher, which is why the little girl's laughing at her. But you can see that it's very informal, that they're not interested in the camera, they're chatting, getting on with chores together. Again, another example from Indonesia, the researcher is the one in the glasses, but perhaps unusually for a lot of Indonesians who might have joined this call, helping in the kitchen. You can see the dad's helping in the kitchen too, but chatting about sort of, in that case, it was nutrition, hygiene and nutrition study we did some years ago. That's me. So the idea is just sort of hanging out, chatting, letting the conversation flow, making it two-way, and no note taking. You'll see in these, none of these photographs has anybody taking any notes. We can use interactive visual exercises. So some of the things, some of the visuals that are used in PAR, participatory action research, and used in PRA, this can be used. We tend not to use them until we've been with families for some time. But this is an example of some children with whom we had built up a wonderful rapport, having great fun with them. And then this was just another extension of another game where they were looking at their food preferences. Because you're well known and trusted and you're having fun, it makes it much easier than the typical sort of go in for a couple of hours and go out again, where it's all a bit false and forced, or can be. It doesn't show it very well, but doing seasonality diagrams with women in Uganda. And one of my favorite exercises is poo mapping. Children absolutely love doing this. All the smelly places in the village. Gives you quite a lot of interesting insight, sometimes too much information, I have to say. Right. The beauty of immersion is that it provides a space for inclusion for for many who are normally excluded from more formal forms of participation. So in this picture on the left-hand side here, you've got a bunch of those from Indonesia will know mantap boys, cool boys, the ones who would never go to a focus group, wouldn't want to participate in some kind of organized activity. If you tried to interview them, would be probably monosyllabic. And yet, when you're living there, I was actually in a house just this side of the picture. Took about 3 days to unfreeze them. Talking about haircuts, motorbikes. I have a tremendous knowledge of motorbikes now. And then gradually the trust being built up so that they also could be part of the of informal discussions. So this is just the typical group that gets missed out. But we've also got a number of other missed out groups. Here, the lady second from the right is elderly. She considers herself elderly. She says, you know, my time's over. Why should I participate in things? It's too much effort. It's too far. If I get invited to the village office for a meeting, I'm not going to go. So she self opts out also. We then have a woman with a baby here who feels rather awkward about being you know, going to meetings, going to focus groups, participating, because the child will probably irritate everybody, and so she will opt out. We have a young girl here in purple trousers, and she would like to participate in a lot of these things, but says that most kind of meetings, most kind of community events or interviews and so on, she's not the one who gets asked, and so feels that she can't be included. And then we have this guy right in the middle who is basically the village joker. Great fun to be around, but probably not the most useful person in the typical sort of participatory group sessions that we use to find out about behavior change, or anything else for that matter. So again, yeah. So we've got in this picture, which wasn't set up in any way. It was just a picture that we happened to take and then thought afterwards, well, it really does demonstrate how many people are either self-exclude or by our sampling frames and so on are excluded from research and formative research. Okay, so that's the inclusive bit. And if we're really going to leave no one behind, it's important that we think about that. And then the last of the I's is the fact that we can be iterative. So one of the most frustrating things I used to find about doing qualitative formative research in the past was that you would do, you know, some really interactive, great fun focus groups, and then get in the car to go back and think, oh, I wish I'd been able to ask that, or I wish I'd been able to see that, or I'm not sure what they really meant about this. When you're there for several days, you have a lot of opportunity to iterate and sort of build on what you're finding out. So this is an example, again, to do with eating, and those from Indonesia will see this is very familiar now, but it's happening in lots of other countries too. These snack kiosks and children demanding pocket money, not just demanding but screaming for it. When you're living in the house, the pester power is enormous, screaming, hitting their parents until they give them pocket money, and you know, this is what is exciting them to spend their money on. So chatting with them, but also being with them in the evenings and recognizing the power of the advertising. I mean, there's very few regulations in Indonesia about advertising the snacks and what they contain and so forth. Some of you in Africa will know of Indomie, which comes from Indonesia. I know that a lot of people snack that now, straight out of the packet without putting water with it. But the power of advertising is, you know, was really interesting in how people interpret the advertising. So that's a sort of iteration there. Going to baby clinics, posyandu they're called in Indonesia, and observing what goes on there and the quality or otherwise of the information that they are receiving and the interaction that's going on. And then this is an interesting one. This was actually a baby clinic where they were, actually it's not that particular one, it's another one to be honest, but where they gave out food for pregnant mothers. And I don't know if you can see in the picture, there's a lot of packaged food, including sweetened milk, chocolate milk there, a sweet chocolate pudding, and fried foods. And being able to talk about why the clinic was giving that and what the mothers, the pregnant mothers, were thinking about giving out that sort of food as part of a nutrition program. So really interesting way of sort of iterating and building up the story of what's going on. So when you're there in situ, actually in the community, we're able to triangulate. That means sort of, if you like, cross-reference information from different sources and build up a sort of multiple perspectives picture. So one of the ways that we are able to triangulate is methods, and then in terms of time, in terms of people, and in terms of place. Oh, I thought I had more on that. Sorry, just go back. So, so in terms of methods, you've got the informal chatting, informal conversations, two-way conversations with a wide variety of people, the households you're living with, their neighbours, the service providers they come into contact with, be it community health workers or teachers or whatever it is, agriculture extensionists. So wide variety of conversations, two-way, so that they are relaxed and not an interview or an interrogation. Then there's the opportunity of being there, the experiencing it for yourself, and the observation. So that is a way of triangulating methods. Then in terms of time, you're there day and night, the difference between behavior during the day and at the night. A lot of very interesting insights into wash behavior. So people who say they use and maybe even use toilets during the day, but don't use them at night, and trying to understand and unpack those sorts of issues. The seasonal issues of I already mentioned, like the availability or access to different types of food, for example. Talking with lots of different people, and place so that you can go from, like in the example with the iteration, going from place to place to build up the story. And you're there, and there's no set order for doing this. You can, you're sort of working at, each researcher has to sort of think on their feet about how they're going to do that. So a typical situation in a community is that you have researchers, so it's never done individually, it's always done with a team of researchers who live in different parts of the village or different parts of the community or slum or wherever it is, with a household. So they have, so the blue one is the household perhaps that they're living with, but they have very rich interactions with the neighbouring households. So lots and lots of opportunities for interactions and triangulating and extending information. They're also going to be going to the marketplace to interact with the people in the nearest town, whatever it is that serves the village. Perhaps interacting at the school, going to the workplace, and so on. So we're doing all of that. We're accompanying people. So if you imagine that then is done with a minimum of 3 researchers in a village, set away from each other far enough to not actually interact with each other during the immersion. So then when they come out, they bring out this rich experience from 3 different locations, and and then we see what emerges from that, and what resonates and what's different and so on. So we can actually, with a sort of a typical immersion study, actually interact, if you want numbers. I mean, we kind of joke about this, but it's equivalent to 250 focus group discussions if you think about the time that's spent and the numbers of people that are involved. So a relatively small study, immersion study, can actually interact with a very large number of people if we want to talk numbers. But really, in a way, it's the insights and the richness that's more important than the numbers, but some people like to know numbers as well. When it comes to collecting all of this data, we have lots, and analysing it. There's a lot to work on. So just very quickly, so you've got the profiles of the community from that lived-in experience. We know what the community looks like and what's there. We've got all those rich conversations. We've got the detailed household data. We've got our own experience to add to this. We've got our own observations. We may have visuals, and we may have photos. We're doing a little bit like photo voice kind of thing, getting people to take photographs of things they like, dislike, change they want to see, whatever it is, and telling stories. We also do quite a lot of digital stories, but that's not really immersion. That's just another way of adding to the database for analysis. So it can be used in lots of situations. So it can be used to inform people's theory of change. It can be used to think about people's perspectives on relevance of change to their situation. It can produce people's indicators of change, which all of these I'll come back to in a minute. It can inform, it can be the first step of a human-centered design process. It can uncover the indirect and unforeseen and unintended and negative impacts of development interventions, something which, again, in our value for money kind of environment that we are, is being devalued. But in terms of learning, this is so important. We need to fail forward and fail fast and understand negatives in order to improve our action, and also to provide process insights. So there's a lot where immersion can add some value. If we look at the People's Theories of Change, just an example here. This is from a rural access program, and again, if you were able to answer me, I'd ask you good road or bad road. I suspect most of you would say bad road. In actual fact, as far as the people living further up the road, this was a brilliant road, fantastic road, because basically there hadn't been a road that was which a vehicle could go on at all before. So having a road which has a substantial culvert down the left-hand side, and with some difficulty is still passable, was an enormous and important change. However, the interesting thing was that the theory of change for this project suggested that putting in roads would enable people to change their behavior in terms of their agriculture and grow crops to export down the mountain. Okay, so that's the theory of change. That's what the business case for DFID was all about. But this is actually, the reality was that up the mountain, the markets became like this, and people were thrilled to bits because it was bringing the Indian market to them. So here we have a market stall with underwear and necklaces and makeup and all sorts of really hugely valued things that people wanted because that was part of well-being. And this is what happened to the trucks. So the trucks came up full of this kind of thing and went down empty. So a complete reversal of the theory of change. Quickly on about relevance. So a UNICEF project you can see here to put child-friendly taps in on all of the very costly project, which actually, I'm sorry to say, anybody who's worked for UNICEF, I've told UNICEF this already, so they also think it's quite amusing. Putting a tap down there with children who are used to climbing all up and down mountains, it soon got climbed on to reach that tap. And if you use the bottom tap, you get wet from the top tap. Not terribly sensible, but until you're there seeing it, not not obvious perhaps. Why are health facilities empty? This also comes from the recent work we've been doing, looking at the promotional materials in Indonesia, and people telling us very clearly that they haven't even seen some of these fruits and vegetables. They don't know what they are. They've never seen a loaf of bread. What is this that the government is telling us to do? So to eat, and then in the end dismissing the whole campaign because it doesn't make sense. It's not relevant. In terms of people's indicators of change, just a couple of little stories. I realize the time's going on and I want to be able to answer your questions, but we were doing some work with senior citizens grants in Uganda. These are very small grants that people over 65 get, and then now they've recently changed it so you have to be older than that to get them. But the indicators were all set externally. They were things like using the money productively to buy goats, to increase their food consumption or stocks, things like that. Very traditional sort of normative expectations from giving grants. However, the living with elderly people for many days in many different places, one of the most important things was sugar. So they were buying sugar in order to be able to make their tea taste a bit nicer and the porridge in the morning taste a bit nicer, but most importantly, so that they could have their friends round. So you couldn't offer tea without having a bit of sugar to offer, and they felt embarrassed to do so. So actually it had an enormous kind of social well-being impact. And once the shops realized that they were getting grants, they were prepared to give the sugar on credit. So it's not an obvious benefit, but a massive social benefit, which actually has now become one of the most important things for the project to be monitoring, rather than the unrealistic things of investing in productive assets like goats, because these are old people who don't have the energy to look after goats. Putting electricity into northern Ghana, some of the villages there. The theory of change was that this would spark, sorry for the pun, the idea of having small industries and so on. No, the most important thing here was that people could have televisions so that they felt connected with the outside world. Huge support. I mean, not just to watch soap operas, they did watch that as well. But that connectivity being really important, that relatives would come and visit and stay with them from Accra and Kumasi and so forth, because now these people weren't quote unquote backward, and keeping your lights on at night for security. So a lot of the things that were really important for well-being and indicators of change, which come from people themselves. Here, working out with people based on their situation in their village, how to develop more appropriate communication materials. This has all come out through an immersion process initially, and then into human-centered design. Another one where now the women are sort of cooking together, which they never used to do, and trying all sorts of local products, local fruits, which they never tried, were just falling off the trees. And another example here where they're redesigning the the baby clinic, so that the counselling area, the socialization area, as it's called in Indonesia, was private and more interactive, and you could have children play areas and so on. So yeah, building up models based on the immersion and the understanding there. So a few very quick, we're watching the time, examples of unforeseen. So in Nepal, missing middle generation. Many of the middle, and this is true in a lot of countries now, middle generation is our migrant workers, elderly people looking after children, changes the whole dynamic about, who is the carer, and they didn't expect to be looking after their grandchildren in that way. Giving out bed nets, but finding they have more use as protecting young saplings than they do from mosquitoes. And then the snack, just the extent of the snacking industry everywhere. A few process insights in Indonesia. There's, with all the concern about stunting that's happened in the last 12 months, staff are beginning to measure for the first time ever the height of babies, but oh my goodness, look at the way she's doing that. I don't think we're going to get anything very accurate out of that, but you don't know that until you go there, and you can't make a staged visit to a posyandu because you won't see these kind of things happening. Child grants in unconditional grants, immediately after disasters. So this was after the recent tsunami earthquake. They gave the child grants in a single amount, and mothers were told to spend it on the children, so they bought baby walkers, which wasn't exactly the point of it. Had they given small tranches over a period of time, it might have been used for what it was intended to be used for, which was supplementary food and so on. This is another interesting process insight from Bangladesh. Free medicines at the local clinics. When they arrive at the beginning of the month, there's a big rush to the clinic. Everybody goes and collects the free medicines, saying that it's their right to have free medicines, and then has a hoard of these at home. They're not actually ill. They use them for their chickens, for their goats, and so forth. And so from the statistics point of view, the clinic gets rid of all its medicines within the first week. Looks like a lot of demand, but it's not quite like that. So okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the method. I was just asked to say a few words about us. So Empatica is a consultancy company. We're actually registered in Indonesia, but we work all over the place. Sorry, this is a little happy bunch from Indonesia. We're all over the place here, so you can see Ghana, Mozambique, Uganda, Lebanon, where's my geography here? Nepal, Bangladesh. We should have, it's got the Philippines just about coming up there in a red one. Yes, to name a few. So that is where we're operating at the moment. Ethiopia, I think, is there too. So we have teams of varying availability in these different countries. But we're very happy to work anywhere and with everybody. So there, yeah, that's it. Wasn't too much over though. I was a bit over, sorry, apologies. Okay, I'll stop presenting now, and then be able to pick up on the questions that Alice has been collating, I think.
Thank you so much, Dee. That's fascinating. We could happily listen for a lot longer. So I think we have one question so far in the chat box, but I'd encourage anybody to just unmute yourself and ask your question directly. The one in the chat box is about language barriers and how you overcome that.
Okay. Interesting. Yes, because language barrier isn't always just a sort of a foreigner. We have, let's just take, for example, in Indonesian, we have, I mean, was it 265 local languages or something, I think. And the more remote you go, the more likely people are going to be to using those languages. So our Indonesian team, some of them do have some local languages, but they're often in a difficult position. At least in Indonesia, most people use Bahasa. But in Ghana too, we had problems with local languages. So we use interpreters if we have to. Those interpreters have to be fully trained reality check researchers, because there's so much in the training about positionality and power. I'm terribly sorry. I've just got this very annoying little dog. Right, you've probably hear him. I just want to let him out. Sorry.
Does in the meantime, does anybody want to jump in with any questions?
I have some questions.
Please, Davina. Maybe we'll wait until
She's back.
Yeah. Maybe put in your chat box if you want to ask a question. I see there's one from Jacqueline.
Shall I write in the chat box?
No, we'll give you the floor.
Oh, okay.
But I'm just thinking to have a little
Sorry
cue.
about that. He's out now.
Okay, there's a question from Davina D.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, so two questions. The first is just how long do you normally spend in the community? And the second question is, I mean, it sounds also, I guess, quite intrusive in a way, sort of spending that time with the family. And I guess you're also, they have to sort of feed you and make sort of room available for you. So I was also wondering how you identify the families, and do you sort of compensate them in any way for that?
Right. No, two really good questions. How long? I mean, we'd like to be there longer than we often are able to be for practical and resource reasons. We've over the years we've been doing, it is over 10 years now. 12 years, I think we've been doing this. We've come to this kind of compromise that 4 nights is an absolute minimum. So it does depend a little bit on what you're looking at, because if you have a very wide lens, if you're looking at, I don't know, livelihoods or something, that's such a wide lens, then 4 days is definitely not long enough. If you're looking at poultry keeping, which was one of our RCAs, then actually talking about chickens for 4 days is actually quite long. So it does depend, but that would be a minimum. And that's sort of what works with households too. So when you are spending the first day is still a bit tentative, and this will partly answer your other question. People will ask lots of questions, wonder why you're there, and then it's not till really the second day when you've actually slept on the floor with the cats lying on your face, or whatever it is, and shown that what you said, which was that you were going to be there without disturbing their day-to-day activities, and you got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you were sweeping the yard with them or whatever it is, then that sort of penny drops and they say, yes, you did mean it, that's what you wanted to do. It's this everydayness that you're asking them to sort of buy into. And it's fascinating, because I mean, your question about intrusion, exactly when I started doing this, I thought, gosh, how would I feel? My goodness me. But it's very interesting, because we usually find some kind of point of connection for that light bulb moment of why we might want to be doing this. So people will often say, for example, people only come to ask us questions when it's coming up to elections. We only see any change at that time, or we yeah, or people don't understand what we're doing. I mean, one classic one we used to use in the old days was, do you know, the policymakers don't know that you all have mobile phones, and everybody's always had better phones than me in villages. And then, you know, you get this sort of whoop of laughter. I say, what? They don't know that we have mobile phones. And even, you know, even recently, Tempe Durkar in Indonesia was suggesting that people listen to radios, you know, and they weren't. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear the phone
Yeah.
behind. Dee, just
Yes.
just there's only a few
Sorry.
minutes left.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this phone call. That's why.
I
Yeah.
just have a few minutes left. So and there's two questions on the chat box,
Yes.
and there's one from Sheila. So can I just put them to you? So there's one on how will the households identify, and then another one on how to record the conversation, I think, interact, you know, with the communities.
Yes.
And an example of the digital stories. And then I'll give it to Sheila right at the end for your question. But if you could answer those two sort of quickly.
Right. So
I think, sorry, could I just say my question is somewhat related to the second question here on how to record the conversations. I was interested in, like, do the researchers go in with a predetermined, obviously you said there are sort of topics perhaps that they're talking about, do they go in with any kind of predetermined kind of frameworks or things for the specific things they're looking for? And are they taking notes all the time, or do they do it in the evenings at the end of the day and note down what they've done? Like, what's the sort of process there? How does that work to make sure that you're not just getting kind of random information, you're getting the actual information that you need?
Yes, absolutely. Before every study or immersion, there is at least a 1 or 2 day kind of immersion in for ourselves. You know, what is it we're trying to understand? What are the conundrums? What are the things that what are the gaps in people's knowledge? In the, you know, what is received wisdom saying? All of that kind of thing. And we try to develop then what we call areas of conversation. So that we often using external expertise. So we were talking about Joy earlier. Joy, you know, sort of threw her pennyworth in on suggesting some areas that we might need to look at. We came up with, you know, again, they're not research questions. They are literally, these are the sorts of topics. So these are the sorts of things that we would be interested in observing. So again, looking at that one, we decided we wanted to do some food diaries so that we would track what people are eating, what children are eating throughout the day. We'd do that for at least a full 24-hour period, but we'd also have lots of conversations about, you know, lots of other things. So everybody's armed with that, but they once we've gone through that, then we kind of put that to the back of our heads, so it doesn't become a prescriptive document to follow slavishly in the field, because of this iterative nature of it. You don't want to go from one topic to the other. That's not very natural. You know, you want to be able to constantly go back to discussions you had on the first day, and, you know, backwards and forwards. So it requires researchers to be very agile and very thoughtful. You know, it's much easier to be an enumerator or even an interviewer and be told what to ask. This is much more thinking on your feet and analysing a little bit as you go along. So that's how it's
it recorded.
Notes.
Yeah.
No, the notes, we no note taking in front of people. I mean, some of the ways around that sometimes is when they're doing visuals together, then things get written on the visuals, or, you know, little points to remember. One of the extraordinary things, and this, I find it very hard to explain this, but our researchers remember so much more. And I can only say this because I did focus groups and stuff for years and years and years, but they remember so much more than if you do a focus group. Because if you're doing a focus group and writing everything down, often you're not making those connections and you haven't seen or experienced it for yourself. So it's a simply one way of knowing about this thing. When you're there and you're experiencing it, it's a sort of bit like going on holiday. And when you go to a new place, all your senses are working overtime. And we get incredibly rich stories. And the fact that the three researchers in a particular spot have not met while they've been there, they'll come up and they'll come together, and one of them will, I mean, a good story here is we found this is in Bangladesh, that well, my particular family was eating an enormous amount of salt in their diet suddenly one year. And I just made an idle question to others, you know, have any of the rest of you? And every single researcher who had scattered across Bangladesh in different communities, they'd all seen the same thing. So then we were sort of trying to unpack that, and there are lots of answers to that story, but it's you know, that you get reminded of things by that buzz within the debriefing process, which asking people to write field reports you don't get, and we're able to sort of
so Dee, after the 4 days, that you spend, you debrief, and that's where it gets written up, or do they actually have to write it up in the evening when they're all alone?
No, I mean, we encourage people to take sort of aid memoir notes in the evening in downtime, or if they've got a moment down by a river or something, you know, a quiet moment, if they need to. And I'm getting old, I have to. And some of them, you know, they'll jot a few things, particularly useful quotes and things. They'll jot a few things on their phone these days. But basically, we try and do this debriefing process as close to the immersion as possible. So they come out, have this 2-day kind of real debriefing, absolutely everything they've seen, heard, interacted with, done. And it's very rich. So they do it as small sub-teams, and then they will come together as a bigger team later on and do a sense-making process, and that has to be facilitated, and then, you know, somebody's leading that process and is then recording it all on extensive debriefing notes. So I'm just at this very moment working on a report on Lebanon. We have 160 pages of debriefing notes to work from, plus all the other kinds of evidence that we have collected. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dee, because it's now 12 o'clock, so I realise we're at the end. There was sort of another question about which households, but maybe we can, Jacqueline, anybody wants to stay on, you can answer those other questions.
And there was an important question on household compensation, which I didn't get round to answering.
Yeah, well, maybe could I just say, just before you answer those questions, so those who want to stay on can stay on, you can answer the questions, we'll keep the recording on. But for everyone else, we'll post the recording on Workplace. With a contact for Empatica if you ever want to contact them. So on the Global Health and Nutrition Workplace, I'll put it on and share it with the SPCC group as well. And so Dee, just wanted to thank you, because that was just fascinating, and I think maybe we all, or at least I, would like to just go and do an immersion training and go and do it myself.
You're very welcome.
So for all those that have to leave, thank you so much for joining. And for those who can stay maybe a little bit longer so that you can I'll let you answer those questions, Dee.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for participating. If you have to go, bye. And yeah, I hope it's just whetted an appetite a little bit for finding out in a different way. There's not one way or another. These are all ways that have to complement each other, in my view. And I don't like pitting, different research methods against each other. I think they all got enormous value. It's just understanding the difference and how they can all contribute to getting richer and richer pictures of what's going on. So yeah. So just to answer those questions, the compensation one is very important. I think. Again, we've actually done our own research on this, and we after doing a longitudinal study in Bangladesh for 5 years, we went back to all the households and we talked about a lot of things about how they felt about having people there and so on. But one of the particular things was how they felt about the way we repaid them, as it were. We do recognise that, that there are the costs of food, but we didn't ever want to make people feel that they had to give us something special, and that was something that happens if you take things beforehand or if you pay, or if so that was really important, that we wanted to understand the reality, and so we were eating very simply, and I can tell you in some situations we have it so unbelievably simply. I actually had one group in Karamoja who came back who basically hadn't eaten for 4 days. So, we don't want to put demands, and we also play that in the sense that, you don't want us to go back to policymakers and tell them that you eat chicken, and they say, oh, no, we don't. So it works very well. So the norms of sort of hospitality and generosity, which many cultures have, they recognise, no, you actually want to understand everyday life, which includes the eating and so forth. So we came up with this solution that we also didn't want to create jealousies in the village, which can also happen, or make it awkward for people to explain why we were staying with them and not with others. So we very discreetly leave a bag of goods, whatever's appropriate, flour or sugar or whatever it is, just basic things. Cooking oil is a good one, and we leave it almost secretly in the household so that it's not public knowledge. It's just a little gesture, and we leave it at the end, so there's no question that we will get that cooked for us. Or it's taken a lot of time. The Bangladesh families said that they didn't want us to give them anything. They said, you're friends, you've been, we've really enjoyed being able to talk to somebody and interact, and that was the basic we're not interrupting in income earning. So that's the compromise that we've come up with, and it seems to work in every culture so far, and that we're now talking about 12 different countries we've applied the same principles to. And now chatting like that, I've forgotten what the other question was.
Well, there was one sort of from Jacqueline early on about how you select or identify the households.
That's right. Yeah. Now this is also interesting. So often, depending on the nature of the study. So for Alive and Thrive, for example, obviously we were talking about early childhood nutrition. So we obviously wanted families with children under 3. But we also were looking for families. Some of the families we wanted to have with only a single parent, some with several generations in the same house. So there was different caregiving kind of options and so on. So we discussed about all the different types of household that might be interesting to understand better. And then with that in mind, we actually spend a lot of time in the village just making sure that everybody in the village knows why we're there, what is comfortable with seeing us, wandering around, chatting. So constantly explaining that we're here to learn and to understand the everyday reality. Trying really hard to avoid gatekeepers for all sorts of difficult reasons. We have had a lot of problems in the early days before we learnt how to navigate this, and we do it ourselves. So you might spend 4 or 5 hours in the village being seen, chatting at tea shops or bars or whatever the appropriate public places in that appropriate culture, appropriate to that culture, and then sort of gradually negotiate why if we're there and we're particularly interested in how young families are managing, then we find young families, and it's done like that. But I mean, there are some sort of criteria, and always this idea that I mentioned earlier, that if you have a team of minimum of 3 in the community, that they're living at least 20 minutes walk away from each other, if that's possible, so that they have a different constellation of people that they interact with. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's great. Dee, just 2 more last questions very quickly, if it's possible. One is if you could give an example of digital stories you've done, and then the last question, and then we'll stop after that, is do we share the objectives of the research openly with all participants, and how do we get consent? How do you deal with that? So the first one is about a digital story.
I expected that question.
Okay.
Right. Okay. The digital stories, we've got some really interesting ones. We've done most of them. We've done in Indonesia. So having done an immersion, and then built up that trust and so forth. We've been able to go back to the same families and go through the digital. I mean, I don't know how familiar the questioner was in digital storytelling format, but that's usually spending about 4 or 5 days with people, so they build up their own stories and put them into their own digital format. And we do that with the same principles that we have for our immersions, but because we've built the trust already, and we know the kinds of things that they might be interested in. So we've done just some recent ones that, well, we did some on nutrition for UNICEF, not for A&T. We've done some on pocket money in Indonesia, and the problems that parents have with being forced to give it, and how they feel about that. And then there's also just post-tsunami digital stories on how they felt about the distribution of the multipurpose cash grants. So these are individual stories, and some of them are available publicly, and some of them, if people are interested, we can sort of share. But they're all only about maximum 3 minutes long. They've got the narrative is by the person who's produced it, and so on. And they can just, and we sometimes use that as part of the database from which to do an analysis for a report.
Would be great to see to share the examples. I'll share them with a link if you can send them to me.
Yes, I can do
that.
Thank you. Yes. And then the other one was
about consent and whether we talk about the objectives of the research.
Yes. Now, this is a really, I mean, we do get ethical approval everywhere. So we obviously have managed to persuade people that what we do, it's a little bit different than conventional. We've taken a lot of guidance from the UNICEF guidance on working with children, because they're, the idea that you can't, written consent is only useful if people can write and read and understand. And I think a lot of what we masquerade almost as informed consent really isn't. It's reading people out a whole screed and satisfying our own needs for apparently getting consent, and actually not being clear that those people are consenting. You're an outsider with power asking somebody to answer questions. So the way we've gone about it is saying, well, actually consent is a process, not an event. So we would start in a village or a community explaining that people from towns don't understand the day-to-day reality. We're here to understand that better, to get to know how day-to-day decisions are made, choices are made, blah blah blah. And that's a fairly gentle kind of start to it. But as you go along, you're constantly answering the questions sort of about why you're there. There is a balance between trying to maintain authenticity, obviously, of behavior and so on. But I think the thing is about being very clear about us wanting to learn and to immerse. And that is the main purpose. And that is, sort of saying, well, people in big cities don't do this. So they're making decisions on your behalf without really doing this. So that's the kind of consent, but it's a process rather than a one-time event. And I personally find it better. That's still questionable, I do understand.
No, definitely.
Definitely. But anyway.
Thank you so much, Dee. It was just, I think, fascinating, and just the fact that there's still 12 people hanging on, I think,
wonderful.
It's a good testimony of how interesting it is. Well, thank you for everyone that's still online. I'll share the recording, and please feel free to share it beyond. And Dee will, continue to be in touch. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Okay.